The years of Mao Zedong's reign marked China with significant tragedies and loud names like the Great Leap Forward, the Great Chinese Famine, the Cultural Revolution. The Chinese people lived in poverty, and China remained an isolated country. Understanding the problem, Mao Zedong decided to change China's position. He began to establish diplomatic contacts with the United States because of the athletes at the 31st World Table Tennis Championships. This event will go down in history as ping-pong diplomacy. Mao Zedong made his mark, and in 1972, US President Richard Nixon visited China. They signed the Shanghai Communique, which adopted a plan to end China's international isolation. Nixon also tried to solve the problem of Taiwan, which would have become an unrecognized country after the international regulation. However, it is still impossible to determine its status fully. We tell you more about the Taiwan question in a separate video, link in the description. In 1976, Mao Zedong died. The struggle within the Communist Party began immediately. Jiang Qing, wife of Mao Zedong, led those who supported the return to China's old policy of isolation. She was opposed by Prime Minister Hua Guofeng and his deputy Deng Xiaoping. With the support of the army, Hua Guofeng carried out a coup and arrested Jiang Qing and her closest supporters. However, Hua himself soon suffered from intrigue within the party and had to relinquish power to his deputy. Deng Xiaoping chose not to hold high positions in the country. Instead, he led several commissions. He appointed his protégés to the senior positions and led the country by using them. Despite this, China knew who was really in power, and Deng Xiaoping is commonly referred to as the main architect of modern China. His policy program came to be known as Boluan Fanzheng, which means setting things right. China continued to open up to the world. Deng Xiaoping made a diplomatic tour of countries in Southeast Asia, where he met the renowned reformer and father of Singapore's economic miracle, Lee Kuan Yew. Deng Xiaoping liked Singapore's success so much that he decided to replicate it in China. A blueprint for economic reform having been drawn up, exemplified by Singapore, Japan, South Korea, and even unrecognized by China and Taiwan. In history, this economic plan will go down as Gaijie Kaifang, translated as reform and openness. The idea of enriching China will go down as Shaokang, which means moderately prosperous society. The first significant change in China was the creation of the special economic zones, which allowed private property, free trade, and foreign money. Thus, Deng Xiaoping hoped that foreign investors would start building factories in China, and it paid off because the first 4 economic zones began to get rich quickly. These were foreign factories, and ordinary Chinese people were able to run small businesses. 5 years later, 14 more cities were opened for free trade, and a year later, the special economic zone would be established in Hebei province. After that, whole districts in China began to receive such status. The most successful of them was the Pearl River Delta. China has abolished collective farms, the idea of which was once borrowed from the Soviet Union. Instead, peasants were allowed to establish their own farms. This not only overcame the hunger in the country, but also boosted China's economy significantly. However, the most famous achievement was the Chinese industry. Foreign companies were interested in Chinese workers. Exhausted by unemployment and poverty, the Chinese were willing to work in factories at minimal pay. To increase income, many worked 12 hours a day. The factories, against all the rules of work ethics, were hiring even children, who were paid even less. This benefit paid off all the problems with moving production to another country. Therefore, many factories were built in China in the 1980s. The first were American automobile corporations that moved their factories from Detroit to China. That's how Detroit fell into decline. China even benefited from Taiwan's investments, although it did not recognize it as a separate country. To occupy its production with anything, the Communist Party of China has made informal arrangements with foreign companies. It began producing copies of foreign goods in state factories. These were poor quality products intended solely for domestic sale, but very often these copies have reached international markets. In 1989, at the funeral of one of the reformers, a rally took place, which quickly escalated into an eruption of protests in Tiananmen Square. Students demanded political rights, workers demanded social guarantees, and businessmen demanded economic freedoms. In response, Deng Xiaoping sent troops to disperse the protesters by force, and we still do not know the true number of victims. In order to maintain power, Deng Xiaoping began to dismiss high-ranking officials who supported the protests, but he soon began to harass those who dispersed the protests. The new head of China was the mayor of Shanghai, Jiang Zemin. He created such a successful economy in his city that Shanghai became China's richest city. After the death of Deng Xiaoping, he gained political power over the country. The same year saw another important event in Chinese history. Hong Kong, which had been part of Britain for over 150 years, was officially passed to China. Beijing promised not to change laws and regulations in Hong Kong, to provide local self-government, and not to interfere in internal affairs. At that time, Hong Kong corporations began to invest millions of dollars in manufacturing in China and enriched it even further. Even world-famous Hong Kong film studios began to move to China. 2 years later, Macau returned to China with similar rights. China's rapid enrichment has led the Chinese economy to expand beyond its borders. Chinese began to work with this in the early 1990s, but only in 1999 they formed a strategy of investing in other countries called Zushuku, literally, go out policy. In 1991, China joined the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forums, and in 2000 initiated the creation of an almost identical economic forum for China's cooperation with Africa. The following year, China became a member of the World Trade Organization. In 2008, China was invited to the G20 summit for the first time, and a year later, the first BRIC summit was held. A year later, the summit transformed into the BRICS. Not only did this take China to a new level in international relations, but it also allowed China itself to become an investor for poorer countries. The first of such countries was Vietnam. Before that, they were in conflict with China. After reconciliation, road and rail services between the two countries were resumed for Chinese money. Chinese companies began to invest in Vietnamese factories. At that time, the modernization of the complex of steel plants TNSC distinguished itself. Over time, Chinese production began to appear in other Indochina countries. China began to lend to them, and trade grew rapidly. Although Jiang Zemin resigned as early as 2003, he gradually ceded his leadership to others for a few more years. Since then, Hu Jintao has become the new head of state. He has formalized the policy of scientific outlook on development. The new authorities decided to start looking for raw materials in other countries. China was struck by a large, raw, and underdeveloped Africa. Over a decade, China has built friendly relations with African countries, working with corrupt governments, military dictators, and war criminals. And this is at the same time when the US and Europe imposed sanctions and trade embargoes on such rulers. African rulers actively agreed to cooperate with China because it demanded only one thing from them: do not recognize Taiwan as an independent country. In 2006, China created a separate public fund to help Africa, and already in 2009, China provided $40 billion worth of loans to Africa. In exchange for these loans, China rented mines with a variety of raw materials. Oil and non-ferrous metals, which are scarce in China itself, were particularly appreciated. China wrote off debts for the poorest countries, unable to pay for their loans on their own, after which it provided new loans. China began to invest not only in Africa, but also in Eastern Europe. But this did not bring many results, because only one country agreed to receive Chinese investment: Belarus. A special economic zone for Chinese companies was created there, Great Stone Industrial Park. It was remembered for the fact that the Belarusian authorities began to take land from local residents without paying the promised compensation, as well as several corruption scandals due to appropriation of Chinese money by Belarusian officials and frequent freezing of the project because of China's uncertainty about its progress. China's change of government in 2013 has not changed China's foreign policy. The new head, Xi Jinping, continued the predecessor's policy and even expanded it to one major project. One Belt, One Road, proposed by Xi Jinping, was originally just a plan to build a single railway network in Central Asian countries to connect them with China and Eastern Europe. The railway was to follow the routes that the Great Silk Road once took. However, a few years later, the African Ports Development Plan was added to the project to improve maritime trade with China. Soon, China also began building railways in African countries, from commodity-rich regions to seaports. And all this was part of the One Belt, One Road project. In parallel, China has also invested in road projects in the Caucasus, Russia, and Eastern Europe. Although the first train on the new route was launched, it could not replace the main trade routes, remaining only an expensive project with no profit. China has also tried to penetrate Latin American markets, initially investing only in non-ferrous metal mines, which are abundant in South America. In 2013, China tried to start building the Nicaraguan Canal, which was to replace the Panama Canal. But this project was shut down a few years later when it became clear that it would bring more expense than profit. A similar failure for China was the Las Bambas copper deposit in Peru. China bought the mines for $6 billion, but failed to complete industrial development in the region. This has been hampered by the persistence of workers' strikes, changes in the Peruvian government, conflicts with local communities, and even attacks by local criminal gangs, which have required the recruitment of mercenaries. In 2015, 3 investment funds were established, of which China began lending to Latin America. China's representatives started to take part into various forums and meetings which were established by the countries of this region. But most of the money spent on projects in Latin America is spent on building basic infrastructure, power plants, roads, industrial buildings that do not generate much revenue for China. Sometimes, China generally spends millions of dollars to keep in Latin America the government that is willing to cooperate with it. Over time, China raised the amount of demands for countries borrowing from it. Also, these demands have become increasingly political. Among the credit conditions, such as non-recognition of Taiwan, China also added denial of the genocide of the Uyghurs, rejection of European or American loans, and concessions for Chinese companies. China also demanded that countries, in exchange for credits, vote in the UN as Beijing wished. Countries that were already heavily indebted to China were willing to make such concessions for new loans. It is recorded in history as the debit trap diplomacy. China began to advance its military projects. In 2017, it opened its first ever military base abroad in the African Republic of Djibouti. China justified its creation by the presence of Somali pirates in these waters, as well as the fact that in Djibouti there were forces of 4 other countries. In the same years, China became the 5th largest exporter of arms. In doing so, it did not shy away from selling weapons to political regimes which are in international isolation. Usually, China sells weapons on credit, which makes these regimes highly dependent. China was the first in the world to allow the establishment of an embassy of the Taliban government of Afghanistan, which is known worldwide for its terrorist activities. The coronavirus pandemic severely stunted China, but it tried to use it to its advantage. China has started blackmailing with the vaccine those countries which have been inactive collaborators. At the same time, it has actively provided free aid to countries dependent on it. Deliveries were so massive that China had to hand over inferior or even defective goods. This caused several major scandals and hit China's reputation hard. Manufacturing outflows, which began in parallel with the pandemic, have become equally problematic for China. The main reason was the strict quarantines that closed these factories for several years. The increasing income of Chinese people and heightened literacy have also contributed to this. Finally, in Africa, China itself has shown foreign investors how to cooperate with third-world countries. China's problems have been compounded by customs wars with the US, espionage scandals in Africa, and sanctions from EU countries. And inside China, political issues are mounting due to internal strife between Xi's supporters and those of his predecessor Hu Jintao. Over the winning streak, more and more defeats appear. All this makes China's future uncertain.